The Maze of the Forsaken. I woke up in total darkness, my head pounding, the air thick with the stench of damp stone. My wrists and ankles were bound with rough rope, cutting into my skin. A faint groan came from somewhere nearby. I wasn't alone. "Who's there?" I rasped, my throat dry as sandpaper. A weak voice answered. "No idea, but if you can move, we need to figure out where we are." I struggled against my bindings, the ropes scraping my skin raw. The air was cool, the kind that sent shivers straight to the bone. I wriggled, rolling onto my side, and realized my hands were tied in front of me. That gave me an edge. With effort, I gnawed at the knot, tasting old sweat and grime as my teeth worked against the fibers. A scraping noise echoed through the darkness, followed by a sharp yelp. Someone else was awake. Then, suddenly, a dim glow flared up, a torch, sputtering to life. The light revealed a dozen of us, all bound, all dazed. A man holding the torch, his face smeared with dirt, stared at us with wild eyes. "They threw us in here," he muttered, his voice filled with dread. I saw them, hooded figures. They dropped us in this place like we were trash. Beyond him, an endless stone corridor stretched in both directions, walls slick with moisture, and an eerie silence settled over the space. We were in a labyrinth. A girl with short black hair managed to free herself and hurried over to untie me. "We need to move," she whispered urgently. "I don't think we're alone in here." As if on cue, a distant sound rumbled through the corridors, a deep, guttural growl that turned my stomach to ice. We called ourselves the Runners. We had no choice. The labyrinth shifted every night, the walls grinding like monstrous teeth, creating new paths and sealing old ones. We scouted every day, mapping what we could before the maze changed again. But worse than the shifting walls were the things that hunted us in the dark. They were not human. At first, we only heard them, skittering sounds in the distance, guttural snarls, the occasional scream of someone who strayed too far. Then we saw them, gaunt, twisted creatures with too many limbs, eyeless faces, and mouths that opened too wide. One by one, we lost people. Some to the monsters. Some to starvation. Some simply vanished. Then, we found the door. It was a massive, rusted gate, set deep within the maze. Unlike the ever-shifting walls, it never moved. Carved above it were two words, "Only one way." We spent days trying to force it open, until finally, by sheer desperation and teamwork, we pried it loose. And then we ran. The outside world should have felt like salvation. It wasn't. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, the air heavy with the smell of rot. Buildings stood in crumbling silence, cars rusted and overturned, the streets littered with bones. There were no signs of life, at least, not human life. Then we saw them. They shambled out from the alleyways and broken homes, dragging rotted limbs, faces twisted in an expression of eternal hunger. Their moans filled the empty streets like a dirge. The entire world was gone. "No," the girl with the short black hair whispered. "No, no, no." A sudden shriek cut through the silence. One of ours, a man named Kyle, had bolted toward what looked like a police station, desperate for shelter. He didn't make it. The dead moved fast. Too fast. They swarmed him, dragging him down, his screams short-lived as blood splattered across the pavement. "We have to go," I gasped, gripping the torch tighter. "Run." We fought our way through the ruined city, scavenging what we could. Every night, we barricaded ourselves in whatever shelter we could find, an abandoned store, a locked basement, a subway tunnel. But the dead were relentless. They never stopped hunting, never tired, never lost our scent. Then, on the fifth night, we heard something worse than the moans. A deep, mechanical sound vibrated through the city, followed by the rumbling of shifting stone. I turned to look back at the skyline. Then came the sickness. It started with the ones who were bitten. Their wounds festered faster than normal, flesh blackening, veins bulging with an unnatural darkness. But even those who weren't bitten started falling ill. Fever, coughing, bleeding from the eyes and nose. The virus spread like wildfire, turning people into something worse than the zombies. These weren't just the undead. They changed. They grew stronger, faster. Their bodies contorted, bones cracking, skin splitting as new limbs burst forth. They didn't just moan, they screamed. And they hunted with intelligence. We realized too late that the maze hadn't been a prison. It had been protecting the world from us. Now, with the labyrinth chasing us and the virus tearing through our group, we had to find a cure, or a way to stop whatever we had unleashed. If we failed, there would be no world left to save. The dead were endless. The maze was closing in. And the virus was inside us all. Then, something even worse happened. The infected among us began speaking. It started as whispers, distorted voices leaking from cracked lips, uttering words that made no sense. Then, the whispers grew louder, forming sentences. They were learning. They were changing. One night, as we holed up in an abandoned hospital, one of our own, a man named David, suddenly stood up, his pupils black voids. "It's coming," he said in a voice that wasn't his. "The maze is inside us now." Then, he smiled. His jaw split apart, revealing rows of teeth that weren't human. We had no choice. We ran. But now, as we move through this broken world, we are no longer just running from zombies or the shifting walls of the maze. We are running from something else, something ancient, something alive, something that has been waiting for us to open the door. And we did. The night we left the hospital, we saw them in the sky. Twisted figures with elongated limbs, their bodies wreathed in black mist, moving in impossible, jerking motions. They had no faces, only wide, gaping mouths that never closed. They weren't just hunting. They were calling something. The sky twisted above us, dark clouds writhing like something alive. The figures hanging in the mist didn't move like anything human, they jerked, limbs bending at unnatural angles, their gaping mouths stretched open in silent screams. But the worst part wasn't what we saw. It was what we heard. The whispers. They slithered into our ears, into our heads, curling around our thoughts like cold fingers. I couldn't understand the words, but they made my skin crawl, my stomach churn. A pressure built inside my skull, and for a moment, I swore something was moving behind my eyes. "We have to go," I croaked, grabbing the girl's wrist. Her name was Sarah, I think. The others were frozen, their faces slack, eyes wide, as if something had reached inside and yanked out their minds. Then one of them, Danny, a quiet guy who barely spoke, let out a low, shuddering breath. His lips trembled, then pulled into a grin far too wide for his face. "It sees us," he whispered. His voice was wrong, layered, like two people speaking at once. Then he screamed. His back arched, bones cracking loud enough to echo down the empty street. His skin rippled like something was underneath, pressing to get out. His fingers curled, nails digging into his palms until blood dripped onto the asphalt. I took a step back. His eyes met mine. Or at least, the black voids where his eyes used to be. "Run," he giggled. Then he exploded. Not like a bomb, more like something inside him had burst through, tearing him apart from the inside. Blood and pieces of Danny rained down on us, hot and reeking of something far worse than death. Where he had stood, something else remained, a mess of twisting limbs, a mouth that stretched from where his chest should be up to where his face had been. And then it lunged. We ran. We didn't stop, not even when another scream echoed behind us, not even when the buildings around us groaned like something was shifting beneath them. The maze wasn't just following us anymore. It was waking up. Sarah tripped, and I yanked her up just as something sharp slashed through the air where she had been. A hand, no, a claw, recoiled into the shadows, the thing attached to it clicking its teeth together like it was tasting the air. "They're everywhere," she gasped. We turned a corner and slammed into a metal door. No time to think. I grabbed the rusted handle and threw my shoulder against it. It groaned, stuck, then gave way, sending us sprawling inside. I kicked it shut just as something heavy crashed against the other side. Darkness. The only light was the weak glow of my dying torch, flickering against cracked tiles and peeling wallpaper. A hospital, or what was left of one. The air was thick with rot and something metallic. Blood, old and dried. Then the whispering started again. I spun, holding up the torch, but the hallway behind us was empty. The voice was inside my head now. They were learning. A shuffling noise came from down the corridor. Slow. Deliberate. Something dragging against the floor. I held my breath, gripping Sarah's arm as the sound grew closer. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hall, just at the edge of the torch's glow. At first, it looked human. A woman, head tilted at an unnatural angle, her hair hanging in greasy strands over her face. Her hospital gown was stained, torn, sticking to her thin frame like wet paper. Then she took a step forward. Her jaw hung open. Not like she was screaming, no, it was worse. It was as if her bones had melted, her mouth unhinged, stretching downward in a grotesque, gaping hole. Something moved inside her throat. Then she spoke. Or rather, the thing inside her did. You brought it here. The voice wasn't hers. It wasn't even one voice. It was many, overlapping, hissing, laughing, sobbing. She twitched, taking another step. Then another. Her arms hung limp, but her fingers twitched like they were itching to grab something. Then she ran. Straight at us. I didn't think. I grabbed Sarah and bolted down the hallway, my heart slamming against my ribs. The doors lining the corridor were locked, each handle I tried wouldn't budge. Then Sarah grabbed my hand and yanked me sideways, through an open doorway, into a dark room. We pressed ourselves into the corner, barely breathing. My pulse pounded in my ears as the footsteps stopped outside the door. Silence. Then. A slow, scraping sound. She was dragging her nails down the door. Then a whisper, so close it felt like she was breathing against my ear. Let me in. Sarah's hand tightened around mine. Her fingers were ice cold. The whisper came again. I see you. The torch flickered, then went out. And in the darkness, something chuckled. The chuckling slithered through the darkness, curling around us like a living thing. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, some low and guttural, others high-pitched and childlike. They whispered, laughed, muttered nonsense that made my skin crawl. Then something touched my face. I jerked back, biting down a scream. Cold, clammy fingers brushed my cheek, just the briefest touch, like something testing me, feeling me out. Then Sarah screamed. I twisted toward her just as she was yanked backward. A hand, no, not a hand, something worse, had curled around her ankle, its fingers too long, too thin, pulling her into the shadows. Her nails scraped against the floor, kicking, thrashing. I lunged, grabbing her wrists, but she was slipping fast. Then I saw it. The thing pulling her wasn't just a person. It was dozens of them, arms, legs, torsos stitched together like a mass of writhing bodies, all of them whispering in unison. Their faces were melted into each other, mouths stretched too wide, their empty sockets leaking something black. Let her go. I shouted, pulling hard. The thing laughed. A sickening, wet sound. Then a new voice joined in. Help me. It was Danny's voice. My stomach twisted. Danny was dead. He had exploded. And yet, his voice was there, mixed in with the others, pleading, crying. Sarah was slipping. My grip on her wrists was all that kept her from being swallowed whole. Then, suddenly, the door to our left slammed open. A beam of light cut through the dark. The thing shrieked, recoiling as the brightness hit it. I yanked Sarah up, and we scrambled into the lit room, slamming the door behind us. Panting, I turned to see who had saved us. It was a man. Or, what used to be a man. His clothes were tattered scrubs, his chest rising and falling in rapid, unnatural jerks. His skin looked wrong. Too pale. Too thin. His veins bulged black beneath the surface, like something inside him was trying to crawl out. His eyes were wide, unblinking, pupils pinpricks. We have to leave, he rasped. His voice was hoarse, shaking. Before they. Then he stopped. His whole body seized up. I watched in horror as something moved beneath his skin. It slithered from his neck to his chest, down his arms, bulging under his flesh like a parasite crawling inside him. His mouth opened, and a sound came out, something between a sob and a scream. Then his jaw split. Not just open, wide. Bones cracking, skin tearing, his mouth stretched far beyond anything humanly possible. His entire face peeled apart, revealing rows of jagged, moving teeth. Then he lunged. Sarah shoved me aside just as the thing that used to be a man snapped its jaws inches from my throat. I hit the floor, scrambling backward as it twitched and spasmed, its limbs bending at odd angles. Then it stopped. For a moment, it just stood there, shuddering. Its head tilted, as if listening to something. Then it smiled. Not with its mouth, its whole face grinned, flesh curling, stretching wrong. Then it whispered. "It's already inside you." And then it collapsed. Not like a person fainting. No. Its body deflated, bones vanishing, flesh crumbling like wet paper. In seconds, there was nothing left but clothes. Silence. Sarah and I locked eyes, our breaths ragged. Then, slowly, I turned my hands over. And froze. There, on my wrist, where Danny had grabbed me, where the whispers had touched, was a thin black vein. Spreading. Sarah saw it too. Her face paled. "Oh God." The whispering started again. But this time. It was coming from inside my head. The whispers curled inside my skull, slithering through my thoughts like a nest of writhing, hissing snakes. My pulse pounded against my ribs, my breathing ragged. I could feel something moving under my skin, cold and wrong, like insects burrowing deep into my veins. Sarah's eyes locked onto the black tendrils spreading across my wrist. Her face twisted in horror. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." I shook my head, swallowing hard. Maybe it's nothing." It wasn't nothing. The whispering grew louder. Not just in my head, around us. The walls trembled, the lights flickering as shadows thickened in the corners, stretching toward us like ink spilling across the floor. And then. A scream. Not Sarah. Not me. Someone else. A voice I recognized. Jacob. We spun toward the hallway. He was running. Or trying to. Jacob, one of the last of our group, was staggering toward us, his body convulsing with every step. His hands clawed at his face, his fingers digging into his skin like he was trying to rip something out. "Help me," he shrieked. And then I saw why. His eyes. They were gone. Just empty, gaping holes. But they weren't hollow. No, something moved inside them. Tiny, black tendrils, shifting, writhing, spreading. And then, with a sickening pop, his teeth began to fall out, one by one, clattering to the floor like scattered pebbles. His lips pulled back, stretching too far, his gums splitting open. And something pushed its way out of his mouth. A hand. A human hand. It grasped the edge of his jaw and pulled. Jacob's body ripped apart like wet paper, his skin splitting down the middle as something else crawled out of him. A figure, tall, thin, its limbs too long. No eyes, no face, just a wide, gaping mouth that never closed. Its flesh pulsed, black veins snaking across its skin. It turned toward us. And smiled. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Run." We didn't need to be told twice. We tore down the corridor, our footsteps hammering against the tile. The thing that had been Jacob let out a sound, half scream, half laughter, and chased us. Fast. Too fast. I could hear its limbs slapping against the floor, skittering like an insect, closing the distance between us in seconds. The door. We lunged through an open doorway, slamming it shut just as something slammed into the other side, the entire frame shuddering from the impact. Then, silence. I held my breath. Sarah gripped my wrist, her fingers ice-cold. Then she froze. I turned. And my stomach dropped. Her eyes were wide, staring past me. I followed her gaze. To the window. They were outside. Not just one. Not just the thing that had been Jacob. Dozens. Figures with twisted, jerking limbs. Empty sockets leaking black. Gaping mouths frozen in silent screams. Standing in the streets. Watching us. Then, as one. They tilted their heads. And smiled. Sarah whimpered. The whispering in my skull grew louder. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. And then I heard it. A voice. My own voice. Whispering, laughing, from inside my head. I grabbed at my temples, my fingers digging into my skin. No. No, I'm still me, I'm still me. Sarah backed away from me, shaking her head. It's inside you. I clenched my teeth. I can fight it. I was lying. The whispers were shifting, growing clearer. No longer nonsense, no longer distant. They were speaking to me. And I was starting to understand. Sarah saw it in my face. She knew. Her eyes glistened with tears. I'm sorry, she whispered. Then she pulled the knife from her belt. And stabbed me. The pain exploded through my stomach, white hot. My legs buckled. I collapsed to my knees, gasping. Sarah's face crumpled. You were changing. I tried to speak, but the blood in my throat choked the words. My vision blurred. The whispers turned into laughter. Sarah turned to run. And froze. A shadow loomed behind her. Tall. Wrong. The thing that had been Jacob. And it was smiling. Sarah's scream barely left her lips before it grabbed her. Fingers curling around her skull. And ripping it back. I heard the snap before everything faded. The last thing I saw was Sarah's lifeless body hitting the floor. The last thing I felt was the laughter in my head. Growing louder. Taking over. And then. Nothing. Just the dark. And the maze. Waiting. For the next ones. And saw the labyrinth. It was rising from the earth, black walls cutting through streets and buildings like a monstrous organism. It wasn't behind us anymore. It was following us. Now, there's nowhere left to run. The dead are endless. The maze is closing in. We thought we had escaped, but the truth is far worse. The labyrinth isn't a place. It's a hunger. And it wants us back.